Today we are going to hang out with Paul Bland. He is the Executive Director of Public Justice. It's one of the largest public interest law firms in the country. We are going to talk to him about class action lawsuits and some of the ways that the Supreme Court is pretty conservative at the moment and what sorts of shenanigans they've been up to lately. Paul has a lot of experience working as a lawyer and as a consumer advocate, and he has a unique perspective about some of these recent pro-corporate Supreme Court decisions that have sanctioned everything from predatory lending to gender and race discrimination. So these things really do matter, and even Supreme Court decisions that don't seem to apply to our daily lives can have an effect on our access to justice. So that's one of the things we focus on at Courts Matter. Hey Paul.
Hi, Tori.
I'm Megan. Nice to meet you.
How are you doing?
Maybe we can just start by talking a little bit about what class actions are, why they matter.
Companies that cheat people and that break the law, that discriminate against women and so forth, they really like to do this to people who are alone, who they can have isolated. People who are by themselves are a lot easier to cheat and a lot easier to steal from. So for example, if you're a woman and you work for a company that pays women much less than it pays men, if you have to argue that by yourself, it can be really hard to prove, and finding a lawyer who will represent you for a single person can be really hard to do. What class actions do is they sort of even the field. They let a bunch of people group together and combine their strength, and it makes it something that you're much more likely to be able to get a lawyer to get involved in, and it makes it easier to prove a case. There are a lot of class actions that have been very successful in recovering for people overcharges from lenders. So for example, I worked on a case where a lender promised people, we will never charge you more than a 24% interest rate on our credit card. And they use the word never in big letters, capitalized, bold, in their advertisements and in their contract. Then a couple of years later, they just rewrote the contracts and did. They started charging people well over 30% interest. You know, we brought a class action, we recovered over $15 million for the consumers. We distributed out checks to hundreds of thousands of consumers, and then we got everyone's credit records fixed. The truth is that most people will never realize they've been cheated, but they have been. And letting companies get away with that kind of thing is really harmful. A second thing, which I think is a lot of people get confused about class actions, is that they're always just about the money. But a lot of what class actions are about will be about trying to change what a company is doing. So I've worked on a number of different cases where companies have sort of a bait and switch product where they promise one thing on their website, but when you actually go, they sell you something differently. Or a company will be behaving illegally. They've got a practice, a system set up where they only promote men or they only promote white people, this kind of thing. And when you bring the class action, you change their conduct. The business actually comes into compliance with the law because of the lawsuit. A really good example of this is about 10 years ago, there was a series of class actions against car finance companies, Toyota Motor Credit, GMAC, Ford Motor Credit. And it turned out that through a class action, you were able to take discovery. You were able to sort of find out what the facts were for a whole lot of people. So it turned out that over literally millions of different files, if you compared what the finance charges were, it turned out that white people were paying about half what an African American person was paying in America for the finance charges on a car. I mean, literally, black people were paying twice as much money to finance a car as white people on average. And the class actions led to this injunctive relief, meaning a court ordered the company to change the way it was operating that eliminated that racial disparity. And that's a huge deal. And so the idea that in America, just, you know, we hear a bunch of stuff, well, we're in a post-racial society and everything's changed. But like 10 years ago, black people were paying twice as much to finance a car as a white person, and then class actions ended that by forcing the company to come into compliance with the law. That's a pretty good change in the society. I think that makes it a better country.
You know, there's been people who have gone through all the decisions of the Roberts Court and found that, you know, this is one of the most pro-business courts of all, Supreme Courts of all time. And in your view, how has the Roberts Court impacted the current state of class actions and class action litigation?
The current conservative majority of the Supreme Court are very radical in the way that they're approaching class action and consumer and civil rights laws. Repeatedly, by 5 to 4 votes, this court is overturning precedents and decisions that have been standing up for decades, and they have this unerring instinct in which they virtually always side with the overdog. So again and again, there will be a fight between an individual consumer or somebody who is a worker who is claiming that they have been cheated or discriminated against, and the Roberts Court looks for these cases, takes them, and then rules on the corporate side a remarkable percentage of the time. As a result of a number of these conservative 5-4 decisions, the Supreme Court's sided with the Chamber of Commerce and against workers, it's actually become substantially easier to discriminate against women based on their gender and pay them less than it was just a very short time ago. And that's something that the Supreme Court has done to America that wasn't necessary. I don't think that the history of these laws or the language of these laws required it, but that's where the majority has taken us.
I'm not buying this inequality business. I'm not.
I know. Women have gotten equal pay for decades.
A lot of right-wing media figures and right-wing media outlets have said, you know, there's no such thing as a wage gap. You know, women and men make basically the same thing. So what I hear you saying is, not only is that not true, but there's a reason. One of the reasons is...
Yeah, the wage gap is real. There are a lot of different workplaces in which men make more than women for the exact same work. Anyone who studies and works with employment law in any kind of detail knows that that's true. And what's happened is that the laws that exist right now to try and protect against that have been substantially undermined by a series of the Supreme Court decisions. And it's a really distressing idea that one of the things that's happened to our legal system at the Supreme Court level is that the largest corporations in the country, which join together through this one major trade association, the Chamber of Commerce, have so much power over what cases the Supreme Court decides to take. And then if the Supreme Court takes the case the Chamber of Commerce wants them to take, then the court tends to rule in favor of the corporation the vast majority of the time. So there are these studies that show that the Roberts Court is ruling of corporations at a higher percentage than any court, you know, going back to like the 1920s. It's an enormous social problem because you've had a lot of laws that were really important to protecting the consumers, to protecting workers, that have been effectively erased by companies just deciding that they don't want to be held accountable by them.
What are some of the current cases in front of the Supreme Court that people should keep an eye out for?
Well, the one case that's pending right now that is really troubling is the Halliburton case. So this is a case involving securities fraud, and the allegations are that essentially the company was saying things that were not true in order to pump up its stock price, and then when people bought at the higher price, when the truth came out, that the stock price fell. So there has been a basic legal principle that's governed our securities laws for years, which is called the fraud in the market doctrine. And the gist of it is that courts are going to make an assumption that if there is information that is significant and false that pushes up a stock price, that people are going to rely on the false information in buying the more expensive stock. And so what the Supreme Court is now considering is saying that the fraud in the market theory is wrong, that there's no reason to think that there's anything wrong with somebody essentially lying to the public to inflate a stock price. If the Supreme Court takes the Chamber of Commerce position in the Halliburton case, it'll essentially be impossible to bring cases involving securities fraud. It'll just be complete open season on regular investors, that you can lie to them, tell them almost anything about a stock price, and it'll be next to impossible for them ever to bring a lawsuit about that. I mean, there are countries in the world that don't have any securities laws, like in Singapore. You can say all kinds of crazy stuff and stock prices leap and fall by 80% in a day. The United States stock market has historically been held to sort of a better standard than that. But if we deregulate it to the point where it's impossible to bring securities cases, then I think that that's going to be really harmful.
How have the class action cases in front of the Supreme Court affected your practice, have affected your clients?
I've been in a lot of cases where the cases that we've brought have made the difference between whether our clients can live a reasonably comfortable life and whether they can be right on the edge of homelessness. I've worked on cases in which people's credit records were completely destroyed by debts that were illegally tacked on to their reports that just weren't fair. I've had clients who took out a $250 loan who ended up paying back $3,500 on it, and they still owed the $250, and this just kept going year after year in their lives. I mean, a lot of the consumer scams in America are just devastating to people. And if you had a system where there was more honesty, or there was more transparency and less cheating, a lot of those things wouldn't happen. A lot of the class actions that I've been involved in have been able to get real relief for people, where we've sent out checks for people, we've gotten debts erased for people. And in my practice alone, I've shifted more than $1 billion from predatory lenders to consumers, most of whom are pretty low income. And I feel pretty good about that as that being part of my life.